Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Masani, I'm Director of the Transportation Center, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the Leon Moses Distinguished Lecture in Transportation. And we have a very special guest and speaker today who will be introducing in a few minutes. But first, I would like to invite my colleague, Professor Ian Savage, to tell us a few words about Leon Moses and his legacy here at Northwestern.
Hello everybody. I was a long-term colleague of Leon Moses, and I was co-authored with him in a number of papers. So I think I wanted to share with you something about who Leon was and something about his life and his work and his importance at the Transportation Center. So Leon was born in 1924, and he was born in New York City, and he eventually was undergraduate and then became a PhD student with, I don't know if Leon's yet, but Harvard. And he was part of a Harvard research project, and they were doing work of what at the time was referred to as input-output analysis, which was sort of looking at, you could think of it as sort of either in international or in terms of domestic terms, interregional production, when goods were arriving, how much was being produced, where the stuff was going to. And Leon took a view that these models did not treat transportation with a degree of sort of rigor that you would think, in the sense that you were looking at stuff being manufactured in Ohio or maybe being consumed in California or something, and how it actually got from Ohio to California was treated in a very simplistic way. So that was the type of work that Leon did. He came to Northwestern in 1959 with a picture, I'm not sure what year it is, but it says on there on the back it was taken by a professional photographic studio here in Evanston. And he was the director of research at the Transportation Center in the early 1960s, at a time when the Transportation Center was at that time under a decade old. And his interests moved into sort of urban and regional economics, thinking about how regions compete with each other, but he looked at it more from sort of an economic production end of things, how firms would decide to locate their plants. So very close to the intersection of what we nowadays would think of as industrial engineering. He was involved in other areas of transportation. There was a big study funded in the late 1960s looking at done for the Corps of Engineers, looking at renovation of locks and dams. I'm not sure if anything ever happened out of this, right? But using cost-benefit analysis to try and estimate sort of demand for products on the inland waterways. He was also at a point by a time into the 1970s, at a very exciting time for our profession. Because here we had the drumbeat of professional opinion moving the strict regulatory regimes which we've had since the 1880s for the railroads and many other modes since the 1920s and the 1930s, that there was inadequacies in this. So Leon was involved in a series of 5 conferences, bringing people together, discussing whether we should have regulatory reform in all different forms of transportation. There was a conference on trucking, there was one on the railroads, one on airlines, there was one on urban transportation. I'm sure David went very far on that, right? And another one on the maritime industries. The other time he was very active, both in management of the profession, chairing the economics department, president of the Regional Science Association, and importantly for us, the director of the Transportation Center through much of the latter part of the 1970s. And this picture here, in many ways, I think there's some people in the class here who at least saw Leon as an instructor at that time. This is the classic Leon Moses, right? Tie undone. It's obviously after the days they banned smoking by professors in the classroom, right? But there at the chalkboard, he was very sort of his style of teaching, like intermediate micro, was very much getting in the student's face and asking them for call and response on things. So a real sort of Brooklyn tough guy in some ways, right? But underneath it, actually one of the more sweetest and most generous person with his time and money I think we've ever met, right? So I didn't come on the scene until in the 1980s, and at that time we had, I recognise two of the people in this picture. The third one I have no idea who it is, right? But it's, there was some of the, it had been deregulation, and some people were questioning some of the maybe downsides of this. There was a lot of concern in the trucking and in the aviation industry that the unleashing of competition had led to a decline in safety. So Leon and some of my colleagues at the back, John Panzer, and were involved in drumming up some money from various people, including from the American Trucking Associations, the US DOT, a real unholy alliance of every side. Even the Teamsters put in money. So Leon managed to get all these people to contribute at the same time, I had no idea. And so we held a conference on deregulation of safety. This photo is actually Halloween 1989, right? It's the release of the book that came out of it. Long-time observers of the Transportation Centre will recognise the staircase in our old building here, right? So it's so Leon then went on to work at issues of other areas of safety. We did a conference on transportation hazardous materials, which was a big deal about 1980. We did some work together on trucking safety. So Leon retired in 2005, and this lecture was set up. The first one was in 2011, so Bob Gordon was our first speaker. So one thing I like about this slide is that you recognise the picture of Leon. Actually, this was taken at Bob Gordon's lecture, the very first of this series here, where Leon was there, and you also recognise his wife, Ray Moses, who was with him for many years and was a professor of linguistics here at the university, and was a feature of Leon and Ray. They were just a social fixture at the university. So we've had a series of speakers over the time, and for today's speaker, Hani is going to do the introduction. So Leon was a very formative person in my career. I think in the profession he was someone who was respected and was sort of a larger-than-life personality. And I think it's an honour that this lecture is named after him. So, Hani.
Thank you very much, Ian. So one of the, well, by far the best part of my job is that I get to host and introduce our distinguished speakers, particularly this evening's distinguished speaker. For anybody who has worked in the transportation area, particularly looking at aspects of demand, behavior, the name Dan McFadden stands out, obviously, as the hero, the founder, the legend for many of us. So I'm particularly pleased that he could be with us today. Professor McFadden is currently the Presidential Professor of Health Economics at the University of Southern California, and he's also a professor of the Graduate School at the University of California, Berkeley, where he is also the E. Morris Cox Professor of Economics and Director of the Econometrics Laboratory Emeritus at Berkeley. Also at USC, he has joint appointments in the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy and the Department of Economics at USC Dornsife College. And of course, Professor McFadden has had a truly distinguished career and list of accomplishments in the areas of econometrics, economic theory, and mathematical economics, currently working in health economics, and to those of us in the transportation arena, transportation economics, and environmental economics. For his contributions, he was recognized through the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2000, along with James Heckman for the development of theories and methods for analyzing discrete choice. And he's also the recipient of the Frisch Medal from the Econometric Society and the Nemmers Prize in Economics from Northwestern University. Of course, his published record in terms of books and highly influential articles is quite vast and large. He, in addition, of course, to recognition through winning the 2000 Nobel Memorial Prize, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1977 and to the National Academy of Sciences in 1981. He served president of the Econometric Society, the American Economic Society, and the Western Economics Association International. And this is only a very small sample of his accomplishments and affiliations. Now, on a more personal note, I was very fortunate to actually be a student in his class at MIT. That was the Applied Econometrics graduate class at MIT. And of course, he just blew everybody's mind with the ease with which he was presenting all this really complicated material. And it was notable because Dan would walk in, he never had any notes with him. I mean, never. And he would just start writing on the board, going through all these complex derivations, all in matrix notation, I would add, and lecture after another. And, it wasn't just the math, of course, it was really conveying the concepts and so on. All of us were absolutely in awe. So, Dan, thank you for teaching us very well, and hopefully we have not disappointed you, over the years. So, though I will say that he has assured me that he will not have equations today, so can relax, especially for those who have not seen, calculus in a few years. So you could relax, and he's going to share with us today, I guess, his current, some of his current interests and his perspectives on modeling discrete choices, modeling human choices, and modeling behavior. Dan?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Is this reverberating? Is it too close? I very much appreciate the invitation. Leon Moses was a major figure and promoter of transportation economics, and it's a pleasure to be able to speak in his name. And beyond that, transportation has been, over my entire career, a source of problems, ideas, and solutions. So while I mostly dwell elsewhere, I commute regularly to transportation. Always find it beneficial to do so. So today's talk will be about how people make choices, and in particular, what the general finding on choice behavior implies for transportation behavior. But I'm going to bookend the talk by saying something at the very beginning and the very end about the relationship between the study of choice behavior, what you might call structural or cause and effect modeling, often done in a kind of a laboratory or batch way. And the kind of data that transportation has always had. Transportation has always been a big data science. The definition of big data has changed a lot over the decades, but it was big data in the 60s relative to what people could process, and it's big data now. Now, of course, it's really big data and really powerful computer algorithms to analyze it. And I'd like to end this talk by talking a little bit about how that interfaces and should interface with the study of how people actually behave. So here's the outline. I'll start by going back to the 1960s and transportation data to set things up. Then I'm going to talk about behavioral travel demand modeling and how it got started. Most of you have had some exposure to this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. And then I'd like to move on to discuss what we've learned about how people make choices between the early 70s and now, and what you can do about that, how you can use that in analysis of our predictions of behavior. And then, as I say, I will finish by talking a little bit about handling transportation data. So in the 1960s, the big data in transportation were origin destination tables. You'd take a big survey of people in an urban area. You'd identify them by the zone they lived in, and if you're studying commute during rush hour, the destination they go to, and you'd have a big table with the numbers of people flowing from one to the other. And you could take these tables, you could try to use them to explain behavior by mode. You could try to update them as populations changed, or the costs of travel between one zone and another changed. And a very common way of doing that, this is the only equation, by the way, in this today's presentation, was something called a gravity model, modeled after the classical physics gravity model, originally invented in 1885, or applied to transportation and problems in 1885. In its most modern version, George Zift in 1946, and the idea was that the number of trips between zones was proportional to the product of the sort of the number of travelers in one zone and the attractions they had in a second zone, divided by some kind of measure of distance or cost, some kind of generalized cost, often raised to some power. And the problem with that model was this: it actually fits aggregate trip tables fairly well, the gravity model does. It gives reasonable prediction of response to zone-wide policies, like changes in the gasoline tax. But it lacks sensitivity to intra-zone heterogeneity. It has trouble dealing with changes in sociodemographics, or say something like car ownership. Very hard to capture that within a model like this. And it's not easy to reconcile with individual transportation choice data or use the information contained in information travel behavior. So the response to that in the end of the 1960s was in a project that came out of the Federal Highway Administration, was to try to develop models of urban travel demand which worked with data from individuals and employed some notion of what the structural invariance, what the structural nature of choice was, what really drives choice in a way that you could identify that would carry over from one situation to, say, another situation after a policy intervention. So that project was done by the Charles River Associates had names like Jerry Kraft, Bill Tye, and Tom Dominzik attached to it. The academic advisors were Marvin Mannheim and, misprint in my slide, John Meyer, not John Kane, were the academic advisors. Peter Diamond and Robert Hall, professors of economics at MIT, were the primary academic consultants. Diamond and Hall recruited me for that project because they knew I'd been working on discrete choice problems, had programs for estimating these, and they thought that might apply here, and in fact it did. And that led to the introduction of logit models, what are called logit models, and random utility maximization models into transportation demand analysis. Those models were improved by Moshe Ben Akiva, Kenneth Train, and many others, including two people here today, Ken Small and Chuck Mansky. This talk doesn't connect really directly to anything that Leon Moses did, but I will remark that in a 1958 paper in the QJE, Leon Moses talked about how important it was to disaggregate regionally in the study of economic behavior. So that really was the same, a similar message to the one that recurred in this study at the end of the 60s. Now, the key concept behind the Charles River work, behind my work, was actually itself has transportation origins. Jules Dupuy was a French bridge engineer, and he was trying to figure out the impact of bridge tolls. And he did the following analysis. He took some comments from Adam Smith in 1776, which said that people will buy something until its value in use was equal to its value in exchange or price. And what Dupuy noted was that if you make that curve of the point where that occurs, and then look at the area behind the curve between two different prices, that's a measure of the relative utility of one toll versus another. So you could compare the utility gain versus the revenue gain from changing the toll. And that is actually, that was the first ever attempt to really quantify economic demand analysis. That's where it came from. It came from a bridge engineer. And the economic theory that followed from that provided a bridge to the analysis that economists have done for many decades. Now, this original work did not envision different consumers having different tastes, but that came later, in particular in contributions by Jacob Marshak in 1959, by a psychologist, Duncan Luce, also in 1959, building on earlier work by the psychologist Thurstone in 1927. And when I first became involved in this, I essentially took the work from those two people, Luce and Marshak, and added in what are called hedonic attributes, the features of products, which might vary under policy, and created a statistical model out of it. And that was I originally called it conditional logit, but today we just know it as multinomial logit or flat multinomial logit. And that was the statistical model and accompanying software that went into the Charles River project. Now, following the Charles River project, I undertook a project at Berkeley called the Travel Demand Forecasting Project. And the motivation for this was that the work done with Charles River seemed to have some real value in transportation and perhaps even beyond transportation. And it met a lot of resistance from the transportation community, as many new ideas often do. And I thought, well, if this technique really is any good, it should be able to predict demand for a new product where conventional methods really do not work well at all. So let's give it a test. Let's do a classical study in which we find out what people do before a new new motor is introduced, and then use that to predict what they would do after the new motor is introduced, and see how that compares with what they in fact do. So that was the idea behind this project. It was in the day, 1973-77, that was actually a pretty large project by economics standards. Involved a lot of very intense and hard work on the data collection, and it involved a lot of things other than just forecasting demand. But in any case, the core of that project was to look at the new BART system that was coming into place in the Bay Area, in San Francisco Bay Area. Our survey did not ask any questions about what people anticipated using or anything like that. It was simply asking, in 1973, how do you travel to work and other kinds of trips? You know, where do you live? Where do you work? Point to point and all of that, and then essentially saying, let's carry that what we learn about value of time, value of dollars to people into a forecast of what they would do. The predictions that came out of that were probably quite good. In fact, better than we could reasonably have expected. We were working with 631 people. That was the number of people that we were able to follow over, re-interview over 2 years. And of those 631, we then predicted from the 73 model what they would do in 1975. We predicted 6.3% of them would be commuters on BART. It turned out, in fact, 6.2% were commuters on BART. That was, by contrast with the BART's own prediction, which it would have 15% of the ridership. It made me permanently unwelcome at BART, but it did establish that these models were not ridiculous. At least they seemed to have some merit. Now, one of the features of this, all of this work, this era of work, was it was based on the classic economic notion that people have well-defined tastes, well-defined utility or preferences. Those preferences do not change over time. They're quite invariant. They do go through maximization of preferences, and you put them in a new situation. If you can describe the new situation adequately, and you've captured the features of their preferences, you can predict what they will do when they maximize preferences in the new situation. That was the foundation of it. And there are some details of this which are important and are an issue. It requires full recall and attention to your experience, recollection. It requires consistent, realistic, statistical information processing. It requires predetermined and stable preferences, and it requires that people actually maximize their preferences and the choices that they make. Now, what we found, in fact, is that that's a little optimistic about how people, in fact, behave. All of those red elements are not quite right, and that's what the subsequent 30 or 40 years or so have shown pretty clearly. So I'll give you a couple examples. I'm going to go through a whole series of examples, but I'll give you two in particular from travel behavior. In general, this model, although it has its limitations, has actually had a pretty good record in in various implementations in forecasting and in being sensitive enough to policy so that you can pretty much forecast how those policies will affect behavior. So it's been used for things like determining what would happen if you change the tolls on the BART system, what would happen if you change dwell times in the stations or the headways between cars, and it generally works reasonably well for all kinds of questions like that. So even though it has flaws or limitations as a true description of consumer behavior, it has some, the notion that people might look after their self-interest is not a crazy notion. What's weak about it is identifying what people think their self-interests actually are. Okay, a couple examples from transportation where you begin to see behavior which challenges this traditional economic view. One comes from traffic engineering. What you find if you study driving behavior is people change lanes too frequently. They also they wait too long to merge in merge lanes. There are other behaviors like that, but that's two examples. Let me concentrate on lane changing behavior. I'll just ask you the question. Suppose you go to get in a queue at a supermarket line, at a ticket line, anything like that. Do you feel that you're luckier than average or unluckier than average? Other lines always seem like they're moving faster, right? That's certainly my experience. Well, the same thing is true in traffic. There's a very nice experiment by statistician Tib Serrani, which showed videos of the people sitting in a driving simulator with videos of the people in the next lane. And they watched the video as they were simulating driving, and then asked was the next lane moving faster or slower than you? And about 80% said it was moving faster. In fact, it was moving exactly the same speed, and with variation up and back. And the reason seems to be that people detect movement differently if it's coming up behind them. It looks faster and more threatening than if it's moving away from you in front. I think that visual illusion probably dates back to the days when we had to worry more about being eaten by lions coming from the rear than we had to worry about lions heading off after someone else. Another phenomenon which is true in transportation decisions like buying a car, buying a house, switching to a new technology, say such as a hybrid vehicle or something like that, switching routes, picking a new route choices, that people are often have very high inertia. They're reluctant to try new things. They're reluctant to trade. So the question is, why do you have such strong inertia and reluctance to trade? Well, in fact, people are challenged by choice. People like to have choices, but they don't like to make choices. The Dutch proverb is, "He who has choice has trouble." And the way I would characterize it is that the ideal place for a consumer to live is in a cage with an unlocked door. You know you could leave if you wanted to, but as long as you're there, you're actually pretty comfortable. That's I think a pretty good summary of what makes people tick. Now, there are three kinds of risk involved with choice, and I think a lot of what we see in actual behavior comes out of how people handle this risk. These are a market risk. That is the risk that when you go to make a trade, there's some manipulation or undisclosed costs or something like that going on, that you may not get what you think you're going to get. Second is personal risk, which is that you don't fully understand yourself, and you may actually be disappointed because you've miscalculated. And a third is social risk, which is that if you do something, you have to worry about what your friends are going to think. And I'll talk a little bit about each of these. Not very much about market risk. It arises particularly when people are inexperienced and they face a choice among unfamiliar alternatives with ambiguous attributes, and then there's a tendency to be quite suspicious about what those might amount to. So if you consider transportation policy innovations that are unfamiliar, like a new ride-sharing mode or electric cars or automated driving or toll rings, you're going to have a natural resistance from people because they're just intrinsically suspicious and cautious about new market alternatives. And part of that is perfectly explainable because markets recognize consumers' vulnerability and they tend to exploit it. So that, and markets don't provide a roadmap to success. They may just hide that road, and some consumers are in fact slow learners. Personal risk. There's a quote from Danny Kahneman, which says that there's a large literature that people make inconsistent choices, fail to learn from experience, exhibit reluctance to trade, and base their own satisfaction on how their situation compares with others, and so on. So that's the source of personal risk. And let me just give a few examples. People have what they call affective attenuation, which is that you can recall past experiences, but with diminished intensity in terms of affect, in terms of emotion. You can't really relive the actual emotional high or low you had from past experiences. You have a kind of a one-step removed recall of it. Availability, you remember things that are easy to remember, and you tend to neglect things that are less. Primacy, recency, you tend to remember initial and recent experiences and forget all the ones in the middle. So you may remember the first time you drove, you remember the last time you drove, but you don't remember all the times in the middle of driving. And there are others, such as selective memory. People have remarkable coincidences. They run into someone they know in a strange city, and that sticks in your mind. You go to a lot of strange cities and never run into anyone you know, but you don't record that as a remarkable non-coincidence. So the result of that kind of selective memory is that if you ask people what's the probability of running into someone you know in a strange city, they will give you a probability that's considerably higher than the actual probability of that happening. In terms of how we remember experiences that extend over time, there's some very interesting phenomenon, which is illustrated in the following example. Suppose you're given a painful treatment, and there are two different treatments, treatment A and treatment B. The difference is that treatment B is exactly the same as treatment A, but it goes on longer. There's more pain in total from treatment B. You ask people in experiments which one of these they would choose after they've experienced both. People typically choose treatment B. Most people will say they prefer to have treatment B to treatment A. How could that happen? The reason is that when you remember an integrated experience, you tend to remember a peak and the last of the experience. So treatment B, the last part of treatment B is not so painful, and the peak is the same as treatment A. So in retrospective memory, treatment B looks better. That has implications for the kinds of medical treatment. This was actually done for colonoscopies, but it has more general implications. If you're in a tough bargaining situation between, say, if you're in a firm and you're bargaining with the union or with a supplier, you bargain really hard, but at the very end, give a little something back. And that your opponent will remember you as being a really generous guy and be softened up for the next round of negotiation. One of the main areas where personal risk is important is in perceptions and the formation of expectations. And these are some of the effects that people have found in experiments, what's called anchoring, which judgments are influenced by quantitative clues contained, which are contained in the decision task, but are not necessarily relevant to the decision task. I'll just give you an example. In a study in Los Angeles, people were asked what were the last 4 digits in their Social Security number, and then they were asked for the number of MDs in Los Angeles County. If the last 4 digits of your Social Security number are larger, you will predict more MDs in Los Angeles County. That's anchoring. Context and framing, I'll give an example, and a very important one, which is called an endowment or reinforcement effect. I'll give an example of that as well. But the point is that the way we form perceptions and expectations about things that we don't know about, which have some uncertainty with them, does not seem to follow the rules of probability faithfully, and people make systematic mistakes. Here's an example of framing. This is a classic experiment, so you may have encountered it sometime in the past. People are presented either with experiment 1 or experiment 2. So in experiment 1, they're asked, you have a choice of 2 different procedures, A or B. 600 people are at risk. If you do A, you'll save 200 people out of the 600. If you do B, you'll save all 600 with probability 1/3, 0 with probability 2/3. And in experiment 2, the choices are between C and D. 400 people die for sure, or in D, 0 die with probability 1/3, 600 die with probability 2/3. And you can ask yourself, if you faced experiment 1, would you choose A or B? Experiment 2, would you choose A or B? And the answer is, in experiment 1, 72% of people will choose A. In experiment 2, 78% of people choose B. Those outcomes are exactly the same. There's no difference. The number of people living or not living and the probabilities of that are exactly the same in the 2 experiments. It's just that one is cast as terms of gains in people saved, and the other is cast in terms of people lost, in terms of deaths. What you get is you get people reacting asymmetrically to gains and loss. This is a phenomenon which is completely systematic, reproducible in many contexts. Here's another called ambiguity aversion. If you pick a red ball from an urn, you're going to win a prize. And you have a choice of you can draw from bowl A or bowl B. Bowl A, you know, has 5 red and 5 black balls. Bowl B, is this on or no? In bowl B, you don't know anything about what balls are in. You know they're red or black, but you have no idea what proportion of red or black there is. You have ask people, which bowl will you choose? you pick for yourself which bowl would you choose. A vast majority of people will pick bowl A. But in fact, if you just think about it for a few minutes, both bowls have a 50-50 chance of winning. It's just that people are adverse to bowl B. Adverse to bowl B because it's ambiguous about what's going on. There's a sort of additional layer of uncertainty, even though it cannot make the odds any different. So that's ambiguity aversion, and it appears often in choice. There's also risks that come out of processing, where effectively there's some systematic biases in how people actually go about making choices, even if they, up to this point, have not made too many mistakes. One, people tend to be overconfident in their perceptions and abilities, and over-optimistic about their ability to control outcomes. They often fail to follow through on the relationship between what they choose and what they're actually going to get. It's called disjunction. They are innumerate. I'll give an example. And finally, but I think importantly, they tend to be suspicious. So they mistrust offers, they question motives of people that are making them offers, and they avoid choices that tempt fate. Here's an example of innumeracy. You have a choice, again, of two bowls you can draw, and if you get a red ball when you draw from the bowl you choose, you win a prize. Would you prefer bowl A or bowl B? I think in this audience, everyone would say bowl A with a 10% chance of winning is better than bowl B with an 8% chance of winning. But the majority of the U.S. population chooses bowl B. And the reason they're given when they ask is you have more chances of winning with bowl B. So that's just an example of people's ability to not do the simple arithmetic, and they make perceptual errors as a result. The final risk is a social risk. Another quote, in risk perception, humans ask less as individuals and more as social beings who have internalized social pressures and delegated their decision-making processes to social networks. And what one faces when dealing with social risk is that people make interpersonal comparisons, judging the desirability of options from the apparent satisfaction and advice of others. And while if in choices among familiar objects, they may mostly respond to their own experience and the satisfaction they've gotten from alternatives. If it's something they're not familiar with, they typically are looking to others to give them advice on how good these alternatives are. And people join and migrate between social networks to match their attitudes and tastes. I think a good example of the effect of sociality is the bicycle Peloton. It's a model of voluntary, choice-limiting, energy-saving affiliation with a network. And what it does, it limits choice by accountability to network norms, but it is an efficient decision-making strategy in the sense that not nearly as much attention or energy is required when you're a follower in the Peloton. So a Peloton is a voluntary group, a voluntary social network. It limits choice because when you're in the Peloton, there's clear unwritten rules. You take your turn as the leader, you stay in line, you leave the effort of planning and strategy to the leader of the Peloton. when individuals are dissatisfied with the Peloton, they may break away to form a new Peloton, and often the old Peloton will sanction those breakaways and try to pursue them and wipe them out. So the Peloton itself, I think, is a good real-life example of the operation of a voluntary social network and its primary features. It facilitates choice in the sense that it provides a kind of an automatic or default choice for you without a lot of energy expended to make it. But it's also limiting your choice because you're following the network norm. Now, there are insights from Neuro Economics which are relevant to this. Trade is a contest, and contests always involve emotion, stress, and in fact their own pleasures and pain. So people enjoy to a certain extent engaging in contests, and the utility they get from that is part of the payoff. Now, in trade, trade is facilitated by trust relationships. Kenneth Arrow said that trust is at the core of every trade. But what's interesting from neuroeconomics is that the trust relationships that trade involves are primitive brain functions that have an evolutionary foundation. Specifically, when you're involved in trade, your D2 dopamine receptors and oxytocin receptors, that's a neurotransmitter, are activated. And what's interesting about those particular transmitters, those are exactly the same transmitters involved in social interaction in humans and animals. The interactions that allow sharing, formation of troops, and reproduction. Okay, so what that tells me is that trade came about very, very early in the evolution of humans, and because it simply adapted a reward mechanism in the brain that was already there and was involved in allowing animals to live with each other without fleeing or fighting. And so in the very earliest days, trade seems to have required that kind of trust. And in fact, would speculate even further that kind of trust relationship and the trade relationship itself was involved in the development of language and mental function, because those also are required to do successful trading. So I view trading as being the oldest profession. Another feature from neuroeconomics is that humans are on a hedonic treadmill. They quickly habituate to the status quo, and they experience pleasure from gains and pain from losses relative to this reference point. I've already mentioned that you get asymmetry in the evaluation of gains and losses. You also get an odd phenomena in response to rewards now versus rewards in the future, even a short time in the future, so-called hyperbolic discounting. And it turns out those, what appear to be kind of oddities in how people behave, are related to where stuff is processed in the brain. Gains and losses in risky situations are processed in different parts of the brain. Rewards now or tomorrow are processed in different parts of the brain, and coordination within the brain is incomplete. So you have a physiological basis for some of the systematic patterns of behavior. I'll give you one example of this business of aversion to trade, a status quo effect. This is from one of my classes some years ago now, in undergraduate micro. 345 students in my class were allocated chits with 172 of them saying you're now the owner of a pencil. You didn't actually get the pencil yet, you just got the chit. All the others got a chit which said, sorry, you didn't get a pencil by the luck of the draw, but we're now going to have a market for pencils, and that was operated what's called a second price auction, or Vickery sealed bid uniform price double auction. Each person wrote the price they would pay to either get one if they didn't have one or sell one if they did. And it was set up in such a way that it was in every student's interest to bid their exact value for these things. And if students had stable preformed tastes for pencils, then about half of them who got pencils would have a lower value and use for those pencils than people who didn't get pencils. So you'd expect about 86 of the people who got pencils would in fact trade them to someone who didn't have a pencil, and both would be better off. What happened? What happened, in fact, is that there were 32, not 86, but 32 trades at a price of 35 cents. The median ask price was $1, and the median bid price was 10 cents. This shows drastic reluctance to trade. It's sometimes said that you give this person a chit for a pencil, and suddenly that pencil is much higher value to them than even a second ago they would have thought a pencil would have, and so forth. And that's one of the phenomena that we see. It's reproducible. It's so reproducible you can do this in an undergraduate class, and it works every time. That's my final example of the effects of social and personal risk. I next want to talk about, make sure I have time. Time is short, but I don't have many slides to go. I want to talk about attention, consideration, and choice. Starting from a Herb Simon quote, "A wealth of information creates a poverty of attention." And the proposition is that one of the reasons that people show so much inertia is they simply do not pay attention to the possibility that they have choice, so that either by habit or default, they get into their next situation without ever really thinking it through. And the alternative is that, well, they may or may not pay attention. That happens. If they do pay attention, then they have some further process by which they decide what to consider, what to do due diligence on to discover the characteristics of the products and services they might buy. And then they have some decision protocol that they follow to select an alternative from that. So you could call these the attention, the consideration, and the choice stages, or decision-making stages in choice. I'm going to talk quickly about an example. This is actually, I realize it's a transportation audience, but the example comes from my current research in health economics. This has to do with health insurance plan choice. And in the Medicare program, there's a health drug health insurance which is sold by private companies in a market organized by Medicare, and people have to choose what company they want to and plan they want to buy in that market. And in open enrollment, which it happens in November every year, they either default to their previous choice if it's still available, or they have to pay attention and choose a new plan. What you find is that switching rates are quite low. About 10% of people switch, and that's despite the fact that people typically have about 50 plans to choose from, and plan prices, plan deliverables, health needs are changing constantly over time. Nevertheless, you have these very low switching rates. This is present in this market, but it's also very common in a lot of other markets, like cell phones. People don't change their brand of cell phone or their cell phone carrier very often, even though there's quite a bit of movement in the market in terms of what's available. Now, this is an issue for the operation of markets, because if a market is going to operate efficiently, consumers have to do their part by staying on their toes and voting with their feet for products that are more desirable and abandoning ones that are less desirable. And if you want to intervene in markets to try to improve their efficiency, it's very helpful for you to know what it is that you need to do to get consumers to make good choices. Well, here's a picture of this process. And in our particular model of it, you have these three stages: attend, consider, and decide. You have some unobservable factors, acuity, which we call acuity, and then you have various observed variables that influence these stages. Now, what you can say about this is that these stages have been examined in the past, and there is even an important literature in transportation on the development of consideration sets in transportation. Geoffrey Swait has some papers on this. There's always been an issue that you never can really quite say whether something is not chosen because it was never considered or because it was considered and found to be inadequate. But if you think about it more carefully, there's a clear distinction between these stages. At the point of whether you pay attention or not, you don't know what the detailed features are of the alternatives, new alternatives that would be available to you if you actively consider a choice. So what's going to drive attention? It's going to be driven by triggers like some kind of a shock, so that people think about, consider a new health plan. If their old plan goes away, they can't default to it, or if they have a major price change in their current plan, or benefit change is announced, or if they have some kind of major change in health. When it comes to the decision process, picking a new plan should depend on the attributes available in the new choice set, which you learn about if you consider those choices. But it shouldn't matter what triggered you to pay attention. Is not something that should be influencing your future choice. So that's excluded from the future choice. And we use these exclusions as a way of identifying these separate stages. What we find is that inattention is an important issue in this market. It's influenced strongly by this unobserved factor acuity, which matters. But here's on this slide some of the summary statistics. 57% of people never pay attention, and of the ones that do, about 3/4 of them they pay attention, but in fact they end up sticking with the old plan. So do I have it right? Yeah. I have to do my arithmetic again, but so the feature of that is that inattention is one of the major drivers of inertia. Switching costs matter. People do suboptimal things, but the switching costs are not immense. They're large, but not immense. I will, I think, move on in terms of this and just a little summary of all of this stuff on choice, which is acuity is heterogeneous. It affects memory, perceptions, effort, and decision protocols. Attention is scarce. It's triggered by shocks. Experience, context, and opportunity, cost-induced filtering that limits consideration. of attributes and alternatives. People are not good statisticians. They make mistakes in forming expectations. Utility is local, myopic, situational, and people are strongly influenced by sociality. What are the implications for transportation? First, behavioral choice models in transportation applications should consider adopting the kind of framework that we've found works for health policy choices. Namely, there seem to be distinct stages of whether you pay attention and then what do you do after that if you do pay attention. And it really helps to focus the analysis of the effect of policy interventions by looking at these separate stages. Secondly, in terms of the overall analysis of choice behavior and the development of choice models in transportation, the strong endowment or status quo effects and strong sociality effects are almost certainly present in transportation behavior, and I'd say even more than, I know that there's work in at least some of these areas in transportation already, but I think even more is going to be quite useful in terms of sharpening travel demand forecasts. And then finally, just a general comment on choice models. To the extent that there are systematic deviations from rationality, this long list that I've gone through here, if they are stationary over time in the population of consumers, then you can build them into a choice model, and a choice model will be predictive, even though you don't necessarily have the ability to say exactly how it operates person by person. Now, just my final bookend at the end of this talk is to say a little bit about big data and learning, particularly the new hot topic of machine learning. Contemporary transportation data provides vast real-time monitoring of transportation network performance. And it's very tempting to say you can take these data, combine them with powerful machine learning algorithms, and predict travel patterns more successfully than the kinds of traditional batch processing that's been done for travel demand. Is that in fact true? And the answer is for short-term forecasting where there are no policy interventions that break correlation patterns or patterns, the answer is yes. And it's just like if you are sitting at Amazon or Google and watching what people buy, you can probably do a very good job of figuring out what they're going to buy tomorrow or what they're going to look at on the internet later today from what they've been doing in the recent past. But if you want to predict what they're going to do 2 years from now after a major policy intervention changes the cost of internet search or something like that, the answer is these techniques are not in their most naive form going to necessarily work well. For longer-term policy analysis, machines must learn to recognize causal paths and separate them from ecological correlation. I would say that when we think of machine learning, we shouldn't think of machines as being very different than juvenile humans. In some ways, they learn in the same way. They see correlations, and they tend to attribute causal relationships to whatever patterns they see, and they probably overfit the data they see in the predictions that they make. And so an important part of their education is to train them to not make these mistakes that humans do. So can machines in fact learn wisdom, I think that it's useful to look at what's happened in health, where the business of training, machine learning has gone a little further than I believe it has so far in transportation. Traditionally in health, you have huge epidemiological data sets, and those tell you a lot about correlations. The correlation between having a disease, certain kind of disease today, a certain kind of disease pattern next year, connection between smoking and cancer 3 decades later. Those kinds of correlations are present in epidemiological data, but there's always a question of whether they're the result of accident or a third factors, or whether they are in fact causal. And what happened in medical research is that randomized clinical trials, which are kind of the gold standard for detecting causal as opposed to a correlational relationship, have become more and more dominant, perhaps too dominant, in evaluating medical evidence. But in terms of training machine learning in medicine, I happen to know something about the training of Deep Blue to do medical diagnosis, because I wouldn't say it's a grad student, more a student in law, is one of the project managers for that training. And what's happening is to get Deep Blue to do diagnosis well, it really has to understand the content, the value of a good RCT versus a bad RCT versus a case-controlled study or some other technique which may be affected by ecological extraneous factors. And one of the most difficult jobs in doing that training successfully has been to get that machine to be a little cautious about dealing with correlations. Naive approaches to machine learning, and unfortunately a lot of the real enthusiasts for machine learning, I would say, are naive about what these machines can do. In the great rush of enthusiasm for them, I think they forget the lessons that we should learn from the past about data analysis without structure, and recognize that while there's a tremendous opportunity in the large amount of data that's coming and the ability to process it in a very efficient way, there's also a lot of danger in that those algorithms will lead astray. And I'll just make one quick comment on that, and that is, a lot of people believe that machine learning is really rather miraculous. It can discover things that humans can't see. But I think there are some biases in that perception. You get reported as success at playing Go or chess. What does not get reported is the number of times that you've had to restart the training because it doesn't work and doesn't play well. And it's a little bit like the analogy of doing nonlinear optimization on a computer. Computers do nonlinear optimization well, but they often have to be restarted so they don't go to the wrong place. And I think in learning, machines like adolescents who engage in undirected learning will tend to learn the wrong things and go off on their own to something that doesn't make any sense. So one has to be skeptical. I think there's great opportunity in it, but one has to be skeptical about what it can do now and what's going to be necessary to train machines to do this in a reasonable and useful way. In the specific context of transportation, I would say that the studies of behavioral studies of travel choice are performed the equivalent of randomized clinical trials. They're not always as good as those, but the same idea that you're looking at the underlying structure. And so what's going to be important is that when you train a machine to, say, predict what's going to happen when a lane of a freeway is shut down or closed by an accident, you should have that machine trained to recognize some of the invariants that come out of the structure of behavior. One way you could do that, for example, would be to just feed those machines a lot of patterns that are produced by behavioral models, and which reflect the true causal structure. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan, for this very stimulating presentation. We have time for some questions. So I'd like, and we have a microphone also going around. So if anyone has a question, you have your microphone. Okay, great. Questions? Professor Wei Chen, there. Oh.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring talk. And I'm coming from the mechanical engineering design community. And there's a bunch of people start to use the discrete choice analysis during the past 10 to 20 years for modeling customer's choice behavior for products. So thank you for introducing this method. And to the larger, I just want to let you know that we have a very broad community there that using this method. But it's also interesting you brought up some limitations of the utility-based approach today. So there's some recent examination of using network-based approach to looking at, to consider the social network impact, to consider the impact related to the product association. So the idea is to use a link to model consideration and the choice. I don't know whether you're aware of this kind of approach, and what do you think about a network-based modeling approach, kind of as alternative to the utility-based method?
Yes, the study of actual networks is a fascinating, I think, very productive line of research. I think we're quite early on in terms of understanding how networks work, and I would actually refer back to my example of the Peloton. If you want to describe how people behave in a Peloton, that's pretty complicated, and breaking away from a Peloton is a kind of a singular event. It's and I think it's very, very easy to build models of network formation and transformation that will quickly get into chaotic responses. So, you know, there's a real question: is the behavior of Pelotons chaotic, or is there a non-NP-hard way of describing how they evolve dynamically? Secondly, I think there's a whole layer of behavior, that's individual behavior, which is associated with Peloton affiliate, with network affiliation, network changes, and we have in the audience one of my sources for all this is Chuck Mansky, who I think has had profound insights into how networks work and what their role is in interacting with people's own satisfaction and behavior. And my understanding is that Chuck is has moved on to other research, and perhaps in part because it's such a damned hard problem. So I would say it's extremely important, but I'm also think that we're not close yet to the point where we can say we have a way of modeling network affiliation and response that's behaviorally satisfactory.
Okay. Please introduce yourself when you ask a question.
Good evening. I'm Jim Carey. I'm from the Medill Integrated Marketing Communications Program, and I do a lot of work with big data. Completely coincidentally, I'm working in a couple of domains where you've got great expertise, which are healthcare providers and the intersection with transportation. What is the impact of mass transit choices in Medicare Advantage patients being able to get to the hospital, and how does it impact the cost of servicing all of these people? And one of the underlying things I'm working on is, we've heard of food deserts where there isn't a Jewel or there isn't a produce store, so you have to go to the bodega. Are there transportation deserts also? Is this a reasonable hypothesis? I know you're dealing with different aspects of the same problem, but I kind of have the same intersecting interests as you talked about this evening.
Yes, well, I hope your question is mostly rhetorical, because it's a very interesting problem that I don't know a lot about. But what I can certainly say is that there's two kinds of issues in particular. There's the issue of rural people getting to distant Medicare Advantage service points, and for that you have to ask yourself what kind of basically intercity transportation could you have that would accommodate people who are sick, who are disabled, who are elderly, and so forth. And then there's the second problem, which is simply the problem within an urban area. You may be only a few blocks away, but you may be so disabled that unless there's some special way of getting there, you can't get there. The second problem, I think, is more tractable, and I think it's really worth studying how on-demand ride-sharing systems can work, and it would be extremely important economically to find ways of getting someone 5 blocks to a hospital without a $2,000 ambulance ride. And so one would hope that companies like Uber and others would disrupt ambulance services the way they've disrupted taxi service.
I'm going to ask a question. So then in your attend, consider, decide framework, I think addresses a lot of the limitations, I guess, sort of the earlier random utility models, as you noted, reflecting more of the findings from cognitive scientists, behavioral economists, and so on. One element that you probably only alluded to here is work that was done in the late 70s, early 80s by people in marketing, as well as people in transportation, such as our colleague Frank Koppelman, who's here in the audience, on the role of attitudes, in particular, in this choice process. Do you comment a little bit about possibly roles the role of attitudes that people have, and how that might fit in with your framework?
What I can tell you is that when we did our original work in the travel demand forecasting project, I thought attitudes would be really important. I went out and recruited a psychologist who was specialized in attitude inventory development, and we did ask people about their attitudes towards transportation and all of that. And we found basically that the kinds of things which the psychologists measured did not have very much explanatory power at all in terms of what people would do in the presence of a new mode. That was a little surprising to me. I would have expected that if you asked some people, do you like to try new things? That would have some relationship to whether they actually switch to something new. I still think that might be true, but we didn't find it in our data. Now, what's happened subsequently is that some of the economic psychologists, such as George Lowenstein, have studied affect. Now, affect is not attitude; it's emotion, but emotions do have a pretty strong impact on current decisions. So if you can get someone emotionally riled up, positive or negative about choices, you can have a very large impact on what they will actually choose.
Thank you. Any other questions that we have? Okay, Raymond.
David Hunt with Oliver Wyman. Thank you very much. It was very thought-provoking. I have for many years applied logit models to freight mode choice. And so I'm very curious whether you think your methods would apply equally to freight transportation, deciding between modes, or is freight much more driven by economics and quality of service than the behavioral things you discussed?
Well, the short answer is yes. The logit modeling, basically, those choices are choices. In fact, they're choices which should be easier to explain than consumer choices, because a good logistics department will just do the right calculations as to how and when to ship. And I think, in fact, that's proven true. These things are so easy in that context that people use them. They don't think anything about it. They don't make a big deal of it. In fact, I think that's true broadly. I mean, a lot of choice theory was developed for consumers. It has to deal with the fact that individual consumers are a little erratic in how they perceive things, but they work extremely well for entities that are pretty rational about their decision making. So, for example, for things like predicting mergers and acquisitions in financial markets, predicting the outcomes of horse races, and in pari-mutuel betting, logit models have not only worked, but they've made a lot of people, not me, but a lot of people, a whole lot of money. And I think that's generally, I don't have numbers for it, but my guess is that's generally true, that firms that have been able to use these tools effectively have found that they can really cut their logistics costs.
The other remaining questions? Okay, Ray?
Raymond Chan from Chicago Transit Authority, but an alum here. I have a question kind of in the vein of choices in the modern century. With the advent of technology and social media, there's a lot of marketing dollars that are placed in places like social media influencers and product placement that may have not been around 20 or 30 years ago, though product placement has been around for a long time. But social media for sure hasn't been around since the 40s or 30s or 20s. So has the introduction of these new technologies really changed, have they or can they change the way we look at how humans make decisions, or is it just in still the same framework?
Well, I think the answer is it's changed things a lot. The spread of information and about products and expectations about the desirability of products spread through networks like a contagion. And so what's happened is that social networks have expanded from the people you meet at the corner store to the world. You have the possibilities for much higher rates of contagion, and that's changed the whole dynamic, particularly dynamic for how products are marketed. Well, I'll mention in particular, one of my former students, a demographer, did a study of choice of contraceptive method by women in rural South Korean villages. And what he found was that in a given village, almost all the women use the same methods, but in a different village, they might use a completely different method. And when they were surveyed and asked why, well, I use it because so, my friends knew it. So there you had social networks that were very effective in promoting the use of a single product, but they were geographically limited because of lack of communication across the villages. What you now have is, as I say, is just sort of the power of this thing to go global, go viral, and that's going to change marketing. It's going to change selling of products the same way that recorded music changed the production of music. Instead of having a little band in every town that produced the music for the town, you've got superstars whose songs go around the world, and you can expect that to happen. It's already happening, I think, in terms of products.
Okay, so this brings us to the conclusion of the distinguished Moses lecture. Please join me in thanking Professor McFadden for a most stimulating presentation and discussion.